Really delighted to see so many of you here again today, this afternoon, and thank you for coming along. I'm not going to say anything more than simply hand over to Darrin Nightingale, who's going to welcome Paul Collards this afternoon. So thanks a lot.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me all right, or do you need the microphone? You can hear me fine. Good, thank you. Well, first of all, welcome, and it's nice to see a few familiar faces, but it's even nicer to see some new faces as well. So welcome to Edinburgh on quite a chilly afternoon, but thank you for inviting me to open it. I'll be very quick because you're not here to listen to me waffle. I'm the Head of Education for East Lothian Council, and I know Creative Conversations has been successful in Edinburgh, and I know Mid Lothian, which is one of our sister councils and ourselves, are delighted to be working in close partnership across the three counties. I wasn't quite sure how to introduce our speaker, Paul, today. A friend of mine has a job over the weekend, or during the week, of, I don't know, this could be a bit of a problem of confession time, whether we've got Strictly people in or X Factor people. Does anyone watch the X Factor? Because if not, this is completely lost and I'll just sit down and listen. Yeah? Sunday afternoons, evenings, the results show, they've got the special guests, and it's the thing like 9 million YouTube hits, 14 #1 singles, and it's that montage of video and things. He makes those, and that's his job during the week for ITV. And I have to say Paul could have one of those, because there's things like 30 years experience, £50 million investment programme, travelled 600,000 miles. So I can't begin to describe this gentleman's CV and achievements. But I'll just say a few things and then I'll hand over to David and Paul. I do need to say thanks to Education Scotland for the funding, and also to Creative Scotland and Education Scotland for the Creative Learning Plan and the various related resources. Thank you very much. It is a real pleasure to have Paul here. It's a unique privilege to be able to talk about creativity and creative learning. And I think the fact that we've got so many people on a busy Friday afternoon in the capital city is absolutely brilliant. I understand Paul has spent the morning working with a number of practitioners. Some are here this afternoon as well, I know. And no doubt there will be useful things that hopefully you can add into the conversation as well this afternoon. But a little bit about Paul. Paul is the Chief Executive, and I've got this written down to make sure I get it right, the Creativity, Culture and Education, the International Foundation for Creative Learning, taking overall responsibility for the organisation, its policy and its long-term strategic direction. As I said in my X Factor clips, he travels extensively, developing and supporting educational programmes in many countries, advising governments, regional authorities and cities on their work with children and young people, and is in much demand as a speaker at international events. And I know he's been at the Scottish Learning Festival, and I've heard good things about that as well. He's over 30 years experience of working in the arts, and he's an expert in delivering programmes that use creativity and culture as drivers of social and economic change. He joined the British Government's flagship creative learning programme, Creative Partnerships, in January 2005, and played a crucial role in clarifying its purpose and streamlining delivery of the programme in all schools. But that's not enough, so there's more credits. Other positions held previously include General Manager of the Institute of Contemporary Art, Deputy Controller of the British Film Institute Complex on the South Bank in London. As I said, he gave the keynote speech at the 2012 Scottish Learning Festival, so we're absolutely delighted you join us for this afternoon, Paul. David, as ever, will facilitate the conversation, and we're delighted to say that you could all make it, so please do join in with the conversation.
Yeah, the thing I'm most pleased about in introduction is that you've got a head of education now in East Lothian who actually sticks to his remit, does his homework, actually reads from a script and hits all the right points. And that's a complete break with the well-established tradition in East Lothian, where I was the head of education. I couldn't spell script. Don't think I ever sat to a brief in my entire life, and I was followed by a rugby playing poet, who then went off to the private sector. So absolutely brilliant that we've got you. Excellent. It's restored my faith in human nature and also restored my faith in human resources. Brilliant. And you're smartly turned out as well. I think that's all good. Excellent. Brilliant. And so the headline, we'll do that for him as well. I'm also delighted to have Paul. Shape of the afternoon is that Paul's going to talk, because partly that's what he does. I've heard him this morning. I was absolutely riveted by particularly some sections. I said to him, when I saw him after this morning session, I said to him, there were some things I really loved in your session this morning, and his response was, and which bits didn't you like? And I thought, what, are you Scottish or what? I mean, what's that classic Scottish response, you know? There are some things I really love about you. Okay, tell me about the bits you hate. But the power of what he did this morning, I think, astonishing capacity to meet links, astonishing ability to identify double dividends, both in terms of activities that encourage creativity but also promote attainment, an amazing ability to straddle a whole number of different worlds, the world of education and teaching, the world of the artist, and also the world of the academic. And he brings all of these elements together, I think, particularly well. So we'll open with Paul talking. He's been so good that there's people who were with him this morning who've come back. Either that or they've got early onset Alzheimer's. I actually remember being there this morning. We'll hope it's the former rather than the latter. That's how enthusiastic people have been about it. So he starts, we'll then throw it open for conversation. If you don't have any questions or points of discussion, I've got hundreds, so you can relax and chill. But I'm hoping that you'll also, as Darrin said, contribute to the conversation. So, Paul.
Thank you very much indeed. My philosophy about success is that success is always the difference between expectation and delivery. And those introductions, of course, have completely destroyed any credibility I've got, because I can't ever be as good as the introduction. I've always sought to get jobs which the previous person has done really badly, because it goes down really well. But anyway, I will talk about creativity today, and it is almost exactly 10 years since I started with Creative Partnerships. My background was much more in the cultural sector. But I found myself national director of this program, which at that point was being run by the Arts Council. And there were two key reasons this program was started. And I wanted to start by discussing what the motivations were. So the first was around developing creativity in young people. This was a major theme of the Labour government in England. And their concern was that the world is changing significantly, and the skills that young people now need to succeed in the world are ones around creativity, and that the education sector needed to adapt to make these things happen. A few years ago, I was visiting one of the schools in England, which was in the Creative Partnerships programme. And after I'd finished seeing the work that was going on, somebody said to me, oh, there's this 16-year-old boy who's making a short film about the Creative Partnerships programme, and he'd very much like to interview you. And I said that was fine. And I was taken to the headmaster's office, and the boy was there with his camera, and he asked me some questions, and I gave some answers. And I left. And I thought no more about it, except 4 weeks later, I got a DVD in the post, and when I played it, this is what was on it.
My name is Paul Collards. I'm the National Director of Creative Partnerships. At its heart, Creative Partnerships is about making education a better experience for young people and making sure that they leave school with a set of skills that are going to set them up properly to be a success in the 21st century. Ultimately, if Creative Partnerships is going to have a long-term impact, then it is going to be an impact on teachers, because we can't forever be in schools doing that. What we have to do is to be able to work with teachers and bring around changes in what they do. If you get the right creative process going, and you step on the outside and you're watching people, then people are at their most alive when they're doing that. They're completely focused, engaged in this different place. And it's that look, absolute rapt fascination that you get across people's faces that makes it all worthwhile. You think, that's absolutely
Somebody this morning said the resemblance was uncanny. I wasn't very pleased. The important thing about that story is that a few months after I got that DVD, I was in a meeting with the directors of some of the major advertising agencies in London. Now, advertising is now a very significant part of the British economy. It generates a huge number of jobs. The jobs are lots of fun and they pay very well. So lots of young people want to go and work in advertising. But what's been happening is that advertising has been offering unpaid internships, and that many young people work for up to 2 years on internships in order to build the CVs for no money at all. And obviously, young people from poorer backgrounds cannot afford to live in London for 2 years in order to be able to do that. So the social-economic demographic of advertising is shifting very, very significantly to people from very rich backgrounds. And we were having a meeting to talk about what we could do to create better pathways into advertising for young people from poorer backgrounds. And the directors of the advertising agencies weren't sympathetic at all. They just said, you know, we're businessmen, we're not social engineers, this isn't our problem, and so forth. If our business works on this basis and is making money, then that's our job, it seems to be. And towards the end I said, okay, can I play you a video? And I played some lads. And all of them immediately wanted the voice content, because they wanted to ring him up and offer him a job. Because they could see with that kind of skill that they would be able to have him in front of clients within a week selling them ideas. And the subtlety of his skill is really extraordinary, because it is that characterization which he's able to get into the play, which is so extraordinary. But what was really interesting to me is that none of them knew that's what they wanted until they saw the video. There was never going to be an advert saying that's what I'm looking for. But the moment they saw it, they thought, yes, no, that is what I'm looking for, that's what I want. And to me, it epitomizes a lot of the challenges which face young people as they come into the employment world now. The government in London has this statistic, I don't know where they got it from, but it's 60% of the jobs kids in school today will do have not yet been invented. I don't know how they come up to 60%, but broadly speaking, you all know that that's true, that so quickly is the nature of employment changing, that what they're going to need to know to do jobs successfully in the future, we cannot know now. And obviously this poses a big challenge for education, because it raises the question of, well, what do you teach them that's going to be useful? And, you know, clearly here in Scotland this is very near the top of the agenda, with the Wood report having been published and so on and so forth. And it does seem to me that what it brings you back to is two things, one of which is its transferable skills. Because not only are they going to go and do jobs that haven't been invented, is they're going to do lots of different jobs that haven't been invented, and each one will require new skills, new knowledge, and so forth. So it's those transferable skills that are really necessary. Because what the world is looking for now is not job seekers, but job creators. For young people, potentially it's a very exciting time. You can come out and invent wonderful jobs, and then define your own future. A lot of the jobs that we were training people for, if you like, 60, 70, 80 years ago are now gone. And a lot of them were not fun jobs. So, you know, it's very sad that mining has more or less disappeared in the United Kingdom, but mining wasn't great fun. Now there is lots of fun work to be done, but you have to invent it. And if you're going to do that, you need skills. McKinsey's published a report earlier this year which looked at youth unemployment across Europe. It was a huge survey of 65,000 businesses, educationalists and young people. And one of the things that they said is, unlike other recessions, there are actually more people in employment than ever before, but there are high levels of youth unemployment. And what's going on within the workforce that is causing that? One of the things they said is the people already in the jobs don't go, the people with the experience. So in the last 3 years, for instance, across Europe there's been a 4% increase in the women aged 35 to 39 in employment, because far more women are coming back to work after having children and earlier. There's been a big increase in people aged 55 to 59 in employment, 11% increase, because people can't afford to retire. And so what you have is more jobs than ever before, but they're actually occupied by other people coming in to those jobs, because the employers go, I'll take somebody who's done this job before and has the experience, rather than the young person who comes in. So trying to get the jobs which exist is really difficult, and that's what young people are finding. But at the same time, in the same survey, it said 33% of employers feel that their business is suffering serious damage because of skill shortages. 27% of employers say they can't fill vacancies because of a lack of skills in applicants. So over a quarter have got vacancies they can't fill. And yet there is this huge unemployment of young people out there. So the question McKinsey then went on to ask is, that's quite hard to read, I expect, but I'll tell you what it says. What are the skills that employers can't find? And these are sectors of the economy. So the primary sector is mining and agriculture, secondary is manufacturing, tertiary is services. And tertiary is where the growth in employment is that's going on. And what you have here is the skills that employers find difficult to find. And you've got language proficiency, so literacy, basic math skills, academic or theoretical knowledge and so forth. And yes, they have some difficulty in finding those skills, but they're a fairly small percentage. What they really struggle with is creativity, teamwork, spoken communication, work ethic, problem solving and analysis. And particularly in the growth areas, those are the really big issues. And therefore what they're saying is education should be focusing on developing those skills. Now, in the Creative Partnership Programme, we were launched in order to nurture creativity in young people in the formal education sector. And we've always been very, very focused on research and have done huge amounts of research. And in the early days, we looked at the impact that the programme was having on young people, and we tracked, for instance, 13,000 young people who've been through our programmes over a number of years and compared with 87,000 similar young people who've not been in our programmes and looked at what they did at the various tests at the various levels, and it showed that attainment amongst the young people in our programmes went up much faster than the other sectors. We could show attendance improved, motivation improved, and parental engagement improved. But we said to the schools after a while, this is all great, and obviously everybody's very pleased because we want better attainment and behaviour and motivation and so forth. But are they any more creative? And the schools said to us, well, actually, we don't know. And we said, well, why not? And they said, because actually we're not sure what creativity really is. So we realised that one of the things we needed to do was to become much more focused on what it was that we were talking about. And again, we commissioned research. Creativity is an academic subject which really got going in the 1950s. There's hundreds of professors all over the world who study creativity and publish lots and lots of books, all of whom have one trait in common, which is they're virtually incomprehensible. And if you're going to get schools and teachers to focus on creativity, to say, oh, and by the way, you're going to need a PhD to know what it is, people are going to go, I don't bother. So what we wanted to focus on was developing a language, a set of definitions that people recognised and understood. And what we came up with was these. We call these the creative habits of mind. And they are being inquisitive or curious, persistent, imaginative, disciplined, and collaborative. What we think is complex about creativity is that it's the interplay between those that's really important. So if you're imaginative, you have lots of ideas. But in our view, if you're not persistent, and if you have lots of ideas, but as soon as you come across a difficulty, you give up, then you're not going to end up being a very creative person. Similarly with discipline, if you're going to be a very creative violinist, you're going to have to learn to play the violin really well. And that's going to take discipline as well. And in almost every sphere of work that we do, then actually developing the techniques to do it really well is fundamentally important. So it's the ability to draw on all of those, to go from idea to delivery, that makes you creative. So we shared this with teachers as part of the research progress, and we said, do you think, do you recognise these words? And I said, yes, absolutely. And I said, do you think they're important? And they all went, oh, this is actually fundamentally important to education. We want children who are inquisitive, persistent, imaginative, disciplined, and collaborative. We're less fussed if that means creativity or not, but that defines who I want in my class, and so forth. And I said, okay, that's fine. If that's what you want, and you think these qualities are really important, let's take one of them, say inquisitiveness, go back to your class, and spend a couple of weeks observing your children, and tell us if your children are curious. And we've done this in a number of different countries. So the teachers go away, and they come back after 2 weeks, and we say, so did you discover if your children were curious? And they say no. And we go, well, why not? And they said, because actually there's not a lot of time in class to ask questions. And on the whole, we go, oh, come and see me after class, or I haven't got time for that now, I've got to get through this and so forth. And generally speaking, we ask them questions to see whether they have the answers, but the other way doesn't really happen. And what they came out of these processes were, okay, we value these qualities, we think they're really important, but actually there isn't a lot of time in school for them. If you even take something like discipline, what we really need is self-discipline in that particular case. Schools tend to be disciplined places, but they're actually putting the discipline in for you. Or in terms of persistence, most teachers are very nice people, and they actually step in and help children quite early in the process. So they don't have to stick it through very long, but you'll sort it out. So creating the environment in which these are tested and developed in is really important. But it does need planning lessons differently if you're going to do it. But what to me was interesting, because we did this a couple of years ago, was just going back to the McKinsey's thing, is that these things correlated absolutely with what employers were saying. So work ethic is about discipline and persistence, and teamwork is about collaboration. And it's also about communication. And imagination and so forth is in there in problem solving and that kind of thing. So what we were talking about is the same as what most employers talk about. But what is happening in schools today? Now, I'm actually a huge fan of the Scottish education system. So I don't see this everywhere I go because I see some terrible education system. So this doesn't necessarily reflect Scotland. But I wanted to share some statistics with you. These come from the OECD. And you all know that one of the things the OECD does is run PISA. PISA is this test which 16-year-olds take in science, mathematics, and literacy. It produces an average score per country, and that produces league tables, and the league tables get published, and then politicians all over the world go hysterical. That's how we run education in this world. Everywhere it's very dominant. But actually, PISA measures a number of other things at the same time. And usually, those bits aren't shared. I mean, they're shared with the government, but they don't become part of the national discourse. So, one of the things that they look at is how interested young people are in the subject, and also what they call self-concept, which is how good people think they are at the subject. And the reason they measure interest and self-concept is because what determines whether you go on to study that subject is interest and self-concept, not your test score. The classic example of that is Einstein. Einstein wasn't a great student or pupil. He only got a third class degree at university. He couldn't get a job in academia. He had to get a job as a secretary in a patent office. But he was so interested and so believed in his own ability that he wrote the theory of relativity in his spare time whilst he was doing that. So this is known to be the driver. And so often when I'm talking about this, people will come up to me and say, you know, that's so true. I was brilliant at science, but I couldn't wait to stop the first opportunity and so forth, because those things don't necessarily correlate at all. When you look at the relationship between test scores and interest, it ends up looking like this. What you have at the bottom is science scores, and up here you have the interest in science topics.
And these little black dots are countries. And over here you've got Finn, which stands for Finland. And you'll all know, because I'm sure you've been told, that Finland's absolutely wonderful because they always come top. But actually, Finnish students have the least interest in science in the world and have no intention of going on and studying science. And the reason that we focus so heavily on science and education is because we need new scientists. Therefore, the purpose of education should be to generate lots of intelligent young people who want to be scientists, not generate lots of intelligent young people who've been completely put off science for the whole of their lives, because we're not actually delivering what the point is here. I was in Helsinki a few months ago, and we were having the usual conversation, oh, Helsinkians, why are you all so brilliant? And they said something really interesting to me. They said, you know why we do well in tests? The reason is that our children are just very compliant. They do what they're told. And it says if you look at the PISA league tables, it is a league table of compliance. The most compliant cultures get the highest scores, and that's all it's really reflecting. This then looks at self-concept. So what you have here is how good you think you are at the subject in relationship to your scores. And here you've got Japan and Korea and so forth. They get very good scores and they all think they're rubbish at the subject. And you think, well, how is that? Well, I've spent quite a lot of time in Korea in the last 2 or 3 years. And you can see why. High school kids in Korea go to school from 7:30 in the morning till 5:30 at night, and they then go to after school from 5:30 at night until 2 o'clock in the morning. Every single classroom in Korea I've ever gone into has had children fast asleep, because you've got to sleep sometime. At the back of our classrooms in Korea, you have these high tables like this. And I sit without chair, and I said to the head teacher, what are those tables for? And they said, oh, that's so children can stand when they're working. And I said, well, why would they want to stand whilst they're working? So it's much harder to fall asleep standing. So it's this education system which is simply driven to get you through tests, and you are driven. Most young Koreans I talk to can't remember their teenage years. It's just a fog of absolute exhaustion. But when they end up passing their exams, they don't think, oh, I did well. They think my teachers and my parents did well because they forced me to do all this. And in fact, if I was any good, it wouldn't take me from 7:30 in the morning till 1:30 in the morning in order to be able to do this. I'd be able to do it by lunchtime, like ordinary young people. And so the whole pedagogy undermines their self-belief in the way that the education is delivered. This is looking at maths PISA scores and perceived entrepreneurial capacity. So, this is a self-assessment of young people, but it looks at how young people in different countries assess their entrepreneurial capacity versus their math scores. And here you've got Singapore, Korea, Taiwan, Finland, fantastic math scores. The kids think they have no entrepreneurial capacity at all. Very compliant, as we said. And that kind of thing. And you go, yeah, well, okay, but maybe they do have lots of entrepreneurial capacity, they just don't know it. But you go, yes, but they're not going to go and start being entrepreneurs if they think they're rubbish at it. They're just going to say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do it. So in these countries, this is a huge crisis, because what they know to grow their economy, particularly in places like Singapore, is more entrepreneurial. It's more entrepreneurs. They made a lot of money by making stuff that other people made very cheaply. But the world has moved on, and China makes it more cheaply, Brazil makes it more cheaply, and so forth. They made a lot of money in Singapore by being a financial centre. Hong Kong's currencies, all of that kind of thing. They have to invent the businesses of the future, and they don't have the capacity to do it. So all these wonderful PISA scores is not producing the young people that you want. And then this is another OECD slide, so it's not me. They correlated science scores with youth suicide rates. And it looks like this. In these very high-performing countries, Korea, Japan, and Finland have astronomical rates of suicide. And the Korean head teacher said to me, you know, what's sad about it is that it's not the kids who come last who commit suicide, because they never thought they were doing well. It's the ones who come second or third or fourth who do. Because the only point of education was to come first. It wasn't pleasure, it wasn't interest, it wasn't enjoyment, it was coming first. And when you don't come first, you think, well, I've just wasted the last 10 years of my life, because there is no other motive for it. This is some research that we did with Cambridge University. And what we were looking at here was well-being. It's a big study of well-being that we did in young people. Surveyed 5,000 young people. What you get along the bottom is year 3, year 6, year 8, year 10. And what you get up here is how good they feel about their lives. And you can see as you move through the education system, there's this very dramatic decline in well-being. Now, I'm the first to go, there's quite a lot of stuff that happens here, like adolescence and so forth. So I'm not trying to say it's all schools, but you kind of look at this and go, I think there's a problem here in the way that we're developing young people. And I think as educationalists and as the cultural sector, we should be concerned about it. This one particularly interests me. It's about competence. How competent do young people feel? In England, year 6 is the last year of primary school, so there's some increase there, because in your last year of primary school, you know more, are faster, bigger than everyone else in school, so it feels quite good. But then as soon as you hit secondary school, that competence, related to what the OECD call self-concept, goes away. The other thing which makes it feel very authentic to me is that blue is boys and green is girls. And boys always tend to say they're slightly better than they really are. And girls always say they're slightly worse than they really are. So it's not really that there's a distinction there. It's just that it's the way that genders self-report. But you get this picture that we've been developing an education system which takes the pleasure, interest and motivation out of education and at the same time renders people miserable and finally without the skills that employers say they need to succeed. And you end up, and this comes from McKinsey, the percentage agreeing that education prepares young people for work, it's about 75% of education providers, it's about 35% of young people, and it's just over 30% of employers. And McKinsey talks about a parallel universe existing between education and the outside world in terms of addressing these issues. So, what do we do about that? What we try to do is to change education. What we spent a lot of time researching in all our work is when we found we were having positive impacts, both on well-being, motivation, and engagement, but also on test results, because consistently we had those examples of good test results, is that we then said, well, why does this happen? What's happening in the classroom that leads to better things like this happening? And we came out from the research with this idea of the high-functioning classroom. And the high-functioning classroom looks like this. Essentially what the researchers said is a lot of the most positive impacts that you have is when the learning environment is managed in a way consistent with the right-hand side. Now, I'm not wanting to argue that left-hand side, which is a more traditional style of education, is bad and right-hand side is good. It's more complex than that. Young people learn in different ways, and also different moments in learning require different approaches. There are lots of children who like very passive styles of learning. You know, the teacher sits at the front, talks a huge amount, you write lots of notes, you learn the notes off by heart, you turn up to the exam, you regurgitate the notes, and you pass the test, and all that's fine. The trouble is there's a lot of them do very well in exams, and then they go to university, and then after university they think, oh, I'll become a teacher. And then they come back and go, well, I can't see what the problem is. And the issue is that there needs to be a bigger mix in the, if you like, the vocabulary that teachers have. And a lot more of what happens on the right should be present. And just to pick out a few of those, because I could spend a lot of time talking about this, but in terms of the role of the teacher, Nottingham University, who did one of the major pieces of research here, which is called signature pedagogies, because it was asking the question, is there a signature pedagogy going on within Creative Partnerships program? They said that in a more traditional style of education, the teacher leads the pupil to the answer. And it says there are problems with this on two levels. The first level is the less able pupils never learn to do it for themselves. They're always dependent on somebody on the other side. The more able teachers, they said, it's a worse way. And they came up with this idea that they call minute 37 syndrome. And they said, basically, what happens in a 45-minute lesson is the teacher does stuff to begin with to get you going, and then pointing you in the right direction. And about minute 37, then gives you the answer. Then there's a short pause and a bit of a chat, and then there's a test to make sure you've learned it, and that takes you through. So the problem is, smart kids have worked this out, and they realise they don't have to listen for the first 36 minutes. Because at minute 37, you're going to give them the answer. And so they just wait, they don't focus, they don't concentrate, very little learning is going on. What you need to do is to create an environment in which you, the pupil, has to go and find the answer, and that all of you is doing it all of the time, because then you have everybody working. They talked about how important the activities that the work relates to, how authentic that is, about the flexible use of time and space and so forth, making this a very mobile form of learning, that the self-view are important to the process. Young people have reported to me when we've been talking about this, is they often have a feeling with their teacher that if none of them turned up, the teacher would still give the same lesson. It doesn't really make a difference with them being there. And none of us like to be anywhere where you feel that you're making a difference. And therefore creating a learning structure for your lesson in which you feel you made a difference by being there is really key. And then there's the whole question about emotion. The book I'm reading at the moment is a book published by the OECD on maths. What makes the most successful maths teacher? From a lot of studies, and there's studies all over the world, and they say the two central things that need to be in maths learning is emotion and collaboration. And all the studies show maths taught that way has the best results. And those aren't two words that any of my maths teachers would have considered as being appropriate to the maths lesson. I was talking to some young people in the primary school not that long ago about creativity in teachers. And it related to this question about emotion. So I said, is it important that teachers do creative things in school? And their children all said, oh, it's terrible. And I said, why is it important that teachers do creative things? And this boy put his hand up and said, I'll tell you why. He said, when my teacher is teaching her normal stuff, she's got her grumpy days. And then if I don't understand, I don't like to ask, so I let it pass because I think she'll get cross. But when she's doing her creative stuff, she's got her happy face on. And then I don't mind asking her, she doesn't mind explaining. Now, what he was saying was, I moderate my learning behaviour according to the mood my teacher is in. And most teachers desperately wish that wasn't true. But it is true. It is what happens in your class every day. We often say to teachers, you know, if you're in a really bad mood, you should go into class and go, I'm in a really bad mood today. And teachers say, oh, I can't do that. I said, why not? She said, oh, I'd scare them all. And I go, no, what scares them is the moment you come into the class, they know you're in a bad mood. But you won't tell them why. What have we done wrong? So having emotion on the surface, acknowledged, admitted, and so forth, actually takes the fear out of the process and makes life much more manageable in the class. Now, why they called it the high-functioning classroom was this. The theory that it resides on is that if you're teaching like this, young people are physically, socially, emotionally, and intellectually engaged. And actually, when they're like that, you have 100% of the child in the class. So often teachers say to me, oh, John, I only have 25% of you in class, and so forth. And I go, yeah, but actually, is there the space for the other 75% to be present there? Have you made those opportunities? And when you have young people physically, socially, emotionally, intellectually engaged, they are fully alive, they feel good and confident, and then you get the high performance which comes out of it. So, this has all been very theoretical, but I thought I'd end just by giving you a few examples of this in practice for you to see. So, this is the high-functioning classroom. This is a project in Lithuania. We've got a big program in Lithuania at the moment. Now, the way our programs work is schools apply to be in the program, identifying a learning issue in the school that they want help with. So they don't go, oh, please make us more creative. They go, I'm really struggling with speaking and listening skills in year 1, or I'm really worried about maths in year 6, or I'm worried about biology in year 10, or I'm worried about boys' behaviour in the playground. And we send in specially trained creative professionals who work with that school to devise projects which address it. So in this little Lithuanian primary school, they were struggling with literacy and their kids learning their letters. That's what it is. They're just not making progress. And the artist working with them was a sound artist and said, well, I think they're not learning because they're not listening. So what we've got to do is get them to listen properly. So what's going on in this photograph is that they're listening to their school. They're just lying there and they're listening. And out of that comes a whole discussion about what they heard and so forth. And then they go out about town. Here they are at the railway station. And what they're having to do is listen to all the sounds they can hear and use letters to invent words which reproduce those sounds. And there they're doing it in a subway. And then there they're doing it in an indoor market. And what you can see very clearly in the photographs is this intense level of concentration on what they're doing. But what they're doing, I remember from primary school, is really boring, which is writing a but it's suddenly become absolutely fascinating. Here they are listening to sculpture. They took them to a lecture in the university in the town. It was a Turkish lecture. None of the children were Turkish, they'd spoken Turkish before in their life, but they had to sit there and write Turkish just by listening and using their letters. Then they come back into class and working in groups. You can see they've got their notebooks with them. They're looking at the ideas everyone came up with and improving them and coming up with their favourite lists. And I know that's quite hard to see, but that's from one of the tables. The word at the top left is stotis, which is the Lithuanian word for station, and just underneath that is the word chetikas, which is the word that group of children came up with for the sound of the train coming into the station. Chetikas. So they're all onomatopoeic words. And here, they then had, as a final exercise in this, they were given paintings to select. Each group selected one painting, and then they had to make a soundtrack for that painting, only making, using sounds they could make with their mouths. And this is one of them. And what they're trying to do is to capture the sound of the sea coming in, and so forth. They thought this was a picture of paradise. They wanted it to be quite peaceful. And the whistling is the birds that they can see flying over, coming in to do it. So it's all about learning how your mouth works to use your letters and so on and so forth. But you can see it's absolutely meeting all the high functioning criteria in there. So this isn't about finding space in the crowded curriculum to do something different. This is about how you deliver the curriculum, not what you teach and how you teach. And therefore, it's placing those things in the centrality of the learning culture of the different schools. This is a maths example. So here we were working with 13, 14-year-olds in a big secondary school. We were asked to work with the poorest performing set in that year in maths. So a group of children, they were not making any progress in maths, would we work with them? We put in an animator and a theatre director to work with them, and this short video will tell you what happened.
My name's Fiona Johnson, and I'm an animator, and I've been working with pupils at Harrogfold to engage them more in maths. So my part was to take over after the drama artist had actually worked with the children to look at different scenarios where math could actually take place. Then my job to take over that was to animate what they'd learnt. So we sort of created some dramas, and the animation part came in was to have some animation mixed in with the live action. So we took their graphs and their objects that they were animating. So for an example, one group were the Russian mafia, and their math problem was to drink as many shots of vodka as they could within a certain period of time. So they could measure the distance and speed of the vodka shot going from the table to the mouth and how many they could consume in that time. So they would had a bar, set the bar up, and actually did that as a drama. Then the graph was actually animated with little vodka glasses to actually show how fast they could drink those vodka shots and how many. So it was looking at distance and speed. So it was just a creative way of getting them to be able to recall math problems. And because they, through drama and video and animation, they have to repeat that process over and over again, it becomes much better for them to actually recall and solve those problems. So all in all, after a sticky start and a few frustrations, they were absolutely great. So they've now produced 4 short films that look at distance and speed and working with graphs.
Having experienced the processes of creating an animation, we decided to produce one in-house in order to illustrate more of the key concepts of the maths curriculum. As an arts college, we're fortunate to have the facilities to be able to do this, as can be seen from the following example.
exciting. There is a crisis in the farming industry due to the lack of space in the countryside. Farmers are having to relocate hen coops. We now hand over to our exceptional reporter, Alex, who is on the roof.
Thank you, Jasmine. We have been speaking to local eggs to find out exactly what has been happening.
It's cracking in.
Oh, shut up. It's awful, just awful.
Terrible, terrible, terrible.
We spoke to one of the relocated hens.
It is awful. 30 of my eggs have been scrambled on the pavement. I'd like to know what speed they fell at when they left that roof.
I spoke to an expert who had been working on the equation.
I used the equation distance divided by time equals speed. These were my findings.
The results show that the speed of the first egg drop was 9.8 meters per second. The second egg drop was 9.7 meters per second, and the third egg drop was 9.9 meters per second, giving an average of 9.8. In conclusion, the results show that the eggs should stay in the country. This is Alex reporting for Maths News.
Now, the important thing about that story was at the end of the year, everybody had to sit their exams. And what was amazing wasn't that set's maths results had got better, is that the average maths score in the exam of that set was the highest in the year. From being the lowest performing, they became the highest performing in that school. For the school, it was just absolutely unbelievable, because the question it raises isn't just about how can we get low-performing kids to perform better. It's actually, what are we doing with our high-performing kids that's leaving them so behind in this process? That project took place a couple of years ago, but I mentioned that I'm reading this book at the moment about maths teaching from the OECD. And one of the things is that they give a much clearer explanation in the book as to what was going on there. What they argue about maths teaching is to get the high performance from young people in maths, you have to move them from what they call cognitive processes to the metacognitive processes. What's the difference? Well, it's like this. The cognitive process is when you remember your PIN number. The metacognitive process is you devising a strategy so you do remember what your PIN number is and so forth. And what was going on there is they were developing strategies to explain the theories, if you see what I mean, moving them up to that level. And then the whole maths performance moves up into a completely different space in doing that. But what you need to do is to give them the opportunities to do that. And that's where the video and the artist came in, is that they were part of the metacognitive strategies, which made that possible, and so forth. And also the other thing to highlight in that example is that the artists worked in the first phase, but then the school worked out, oh, we can do this for ourselves. So the second film was made without the artists, once the teachers and the kids had worked out what the process was, and so forth. And that's absolutely key to our programs, which is the long-term sustainability of what we do, is because teachers learn from these opportunities and they're able to take it home. So, is this just about better test scores? There's just a couple more examples that I wanted to give. One of which is I want to go back to this emotion thing. This is a project we did in Austria. The artist's practice in this particular case is that he comes into the class and he had a lot of posters and magazines and things, and the kids cut out faces they like, and they stick them on board and they put them on. And then they have to come up with a story, a monologue, for the character that they've just created. And at the end of that, they have to write the monologue down, because in fact it's a creative writing project to encourage them to write more. So in this class, there was a boy whose parents had got divorced. And it was one of those very messy divorces, where the one of the parents had moved out, and it meant that the other parent could no longer afford the apartment, so they'd had to move, and because they had to move, the kid had to move school, and so suddenly he'd lost a parent, he'd lost all his friends, he'd lost his school, he'd lost his house, and so on. And this was the boy. So, when it came to his turn, this was his monologue. He said, I went to the bar last night. I'm a man. I went to the bar last night, and I had a lot to drink, and I shouldn't have done it, I know, but I drove home. And unfortunately, on the way home, I ran over my parents and killed them. But nobody saw me, so I put the bodies in the back of the car, and I drove them home, and I buried them in the garden. And now everybody's very worried because my parents are missing. And they're all being very nice to me because they think I must be upset. They don't realise that I'm not. Now, what's really interesting about this story is that a lot of young kids at this age going through those kind of experiences, feel incredibly guilty. They feel it's their fault. And the reason for it is that conceptually they think they were these two adults, and then they came together and had a family, and that was me. So I'm the family. So if they don't want to be a family anymore, it must mean because they don't want me anymore. So I must have done something in order to be able to support that. Now, what is really helpful about these projects is it allows the boy to use a metaphor to put out there how he's feeling. And in my view, young people, and particularly in this age range, live with that ambivalence very comfortably. They know it's a story, they know they just told you the truth, and they know both those things exist simultaneously. And having said it, they're feeling enormously better. And you know that amount of emotion going on inside that boy, there's no learning that's going to be taking place. And in normal circumstances, that would have gone on until he's 2 years behind and people said, oh, I can't see what the problem is. How did all that happen? Was it something to do with his parents breaking up? And you go, yes, he had no opportunity to talk about his feelings. Find a way to do it. He didn't want to go, I'm terribly upset. But you create these spaces in which these happen. And it comes back to this emotion thing. If you don't have the spaces, it is dangerous because it builds up and it comes out in other ways. And I think particularly in teenage boys who are less good at dealing with their emotions, it builds up, and it then comes out in hugely inappropriate behaviour. And you get boys who nobody wants in school and so forth, and you go, yeah, but if you go back 2 or 3 years, you would have had an opportunity to deal with that if there was a space like this created. And then the other part of this is about engaging the parents and the community. What nearly all these projects do is produce highly visible things you can share. And that process of sharing learning across the community is fundamentally important. This is a project that we did a few months ago in Karachi. It was in a neighbourhood called Liari, which is an incredibly violent and dangerous place. And it all looks like that. It has these tiny little roadways, pathways, which are no wider than that, and then 5 or 6 story buildings are built up. And I'm sure meeting no building code whatsoever. This was the outside of the particular school that we were working with, and so forth. Now, this school it was run by a small private foundation. It offered free education to some of the poorest children in the world. And they had a particular model, which is they took children in at the age of 3, and the rules were that if we take your child, the mother has to come to school, because the mother was nearly always illiterate, and the father has to go and get a job. And I said, look, is it that easy? He said, oh. The head teacher said, oh, it's terrible. The women do everything. They have the children, they look after the houses, they have the jobs, the men just sit around and do nothing. And I said, so why is it so important? They said, because engaged parents, working, mother learning is the foundation of good learning. You've got to have that as well. If it's just a child without any of that, we know we really struggle to be able to do that. So they make it central. But the issue they wanted us to work on here is that they do take these desperately poor children in, and they give them a lot of the technical skills, but they then, at the age of 8 or 9, they find them scholarships to go to private schools. And they're finding that the young people, as they transfer into the private schools, have an insufficiently robust identity to survive there. They just don't have their confidence and self-esteem in who they are. They often don't even really know who they are, if you see what I mean. And this particularly affects the girls. So they wanted us to work on a project which was able to address those issues. So we worked with a Pakistani filmmaker who has a particular practice that she works in communities, making community films with them using mobile phones. and she has a mechanised rickshaw on the back of which is a huge projector. And after she's made a film in the community, she turns up with the rickshaw and they project it against a wall in the middle of the community, because that's all there is in that community by way of creating an event. So she went in to work with the children on getting them to make a film about their neighbourhood, but it was about them exploring who they were and learning to be somebody more than anything else. And so the children were given mobile phones, and also the other thing is that the schools that they go to later are all English medium schools, so they have to learn English as well. So what their kids were, they were given little mobile phones, says go around the neighbourhood and explore it. And as you're filming, do a running commentary of what you're seeing and so forth. And then when the film was finished, they sent invitations out to everybody in the neighbourhood and said, we're going to show the film. There's the rickshaw, which has arrived for the screening, and you can see the big projector which they got in the back. This I particularly liked is the popcorn wallet turned up, because you can't have a screening without popcorn, and so forth. And then the children had to stand up and explain what they were doing and why, and talk about their learning and so forth to the whole community. And a huge number of people turned up, young people, old people, about 350 people turned up for this screening. And the impact on those mainly young girls of standing up in front of their own community and saying, this is my learning, is very, very profound. And it is an essential part of embedding the learning in young people, but you have to have something to show. It's much harder to do these events if you just hold up a tatty maths textbook going, this is my learning. So finding the format in which you can do it, but it is fundamental to building the platform on which effective learning takes place. And this is just a little clip from the film.
I like my nanny's car. The color is blue. I don't know what is this. It's door, I think. It's my shadow. It is door. Yeah, I don't like it. What is this? I think so it's melt. Oh no, what people can do it? It's a bad thing. Come, let's go. She is my cousin. I love her. My cousin's shadow. She's my mama's son. Mama. And this is my mama.
I'll stop it there. But you can get the flavour. That just that process of going around and commenting on your neighbourhood, incredibly crude. It's nothing sophisticated. But that girl was genuinely beginning to discover her voice for the first time, and that she had a right to comment, to think, to have opinions, and then to be able to share those. The title of the presentation today was, If You Were Doing It Right, They Would All Be Dancing. So the final example is this. This is a science project, primary school biology project, which was looking at the circulation of the blood and how the heart operates. The artist was a choreographer who was particularly interested because he had a heart episode and brought his surgeon in to work with the primary school children to explore how the heart worked and to turn it into a dance using improvisation. This is what the final performance looked like. And so it goes on. So the choreographer in that case was Wayne McGregor, who's England's top choreographer. And he is the professional dancing in that way. His dance come from American dance. His way of working with his professionals is always that he doesn't come in and say, stand here, do this, move like that. He comes in and goes, this is what I want you to represent. Can you do that? You can see what I mean. And he works exactly the same with the primary school children as he did with his dancers, and says, these are aspects of how the heart functions. Now, how should we represent that in dance? And it illustrates to me this key concept that at heart, learning is translation. It's taking something and translating it back again. And that process is right at the heart. And of course, that's what the arts give you all the time, is the opportunity to represent that knowledge in a new form and in a new way, infinitely diversely, but still having the same effect, because never will those children ever forget about how the heart works and the blood starts. Thank you very much indeed.
Absolutely remarkable. Can we just throw it open for questions, points, anything anybody wants to raise? Yes.
The maths project. We was only water. I do promise. When I show that video, please stand it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's simply because of the fact that what you were doing was saying to the children, how should we represent? And they're going, oh, no, we'll do it. Oh, let's do it, we're doing it. Yes, fair idea, yes. Absolutely. I think all the way through, almost all the ideas are there. That's absolutely.
But when we rerun it at CPD, we're using vodka. That works for you. Right, next please. And let's be honest, I want a better question than what were these kids drinking? Let's get some serious stuff. Yes, please.
Reading a lot about creativity and ethics, I was interested in your view about creative learning, where it sits with all the ethical issues it throws up around freedom and individual agency, the teacher as agent, and the child as having choice within that.
That's a small question. So for my second hour, to focus on that, I was listening to somebody speaking the other day about creativity and saying, various countries have tried creativity, but they've abandoned it. And Singapore, they use this as an example, and they said, no, I've forgotten, they had a term for it, but it's now about good behaviour. And they say, no, I don't think you're understanding the issue here. I think we are looking for a different kind of creativity. The paradigm in the 20th century was creativity at all costs. Inventing it. Oh, it's an atomic bomb. Never mind, I invented it. Isn't that clever? If you see what I mean. And the consequence for the planet is awful. And therefore, there's no doubt in my mind, and I think the Eastern countries are better at this, of going, it's creativity with responsibility. That's the kind of creativity that we're actually looking for. Another example, because I couldn't go on forever, much as I'd like to, there was another example that I was going to show, which is about a film that some young people in Sweden made. They were all immigrant children. And it was about fear, and they were writing this film at the time that there was a gunman loose in their community in Malmö who was shooting immigrants dead in the street, just for shooting this. And this went on for 7 months. And what was really interesting about them is they made a film which made no reference to this gunman except it was called Targets. And the word target is used in the film, the English word target in the film, to be someone who's being bullied. And what they did was make the connection between the gunman and bullying and themselves. And if you want to stop gunmen like that, you start with yourself and you start with your school by dealing with bullying and making that. And my view is that whenever you open up ethical issues to young people, they love them. They're really interested in them. And on the whole, we like to teach ethics by giving them the answers. But it's a classic example of where if you let them find their way to the answers,
They always come up with the answers you want to, but they own them because they own the way there. But I think that core question is that we're interested in creativity with responsibility, and that has to be at the heart of what we do. Absolutely.
Okay, yes?
Just speak loud if you want.
No, you're fine. I have a microphone. You deserve it. You're worth it.
I just wondered if you thought there was any value in measuring creativity or developing creativity as a skill, and what place that has. Like you're talking about skills development.
This is a good question. It's a very controversial question. I actually believe that creativity is measurable. I have conversations with teachers quite often, and they know one of these soft skills they're very difficult to measure. And I will go, yeah, you know how every classroom teacher is different? And they go, oh yeah. And 1 year, if they make a wonderful group, they're just so collaborative. And then the next year, they're just like, teachers say, absolutely, I have that all the time. And I go, how do you know this? And you do know it. So the question about measuring progression in creativity is not that it's you can't do it, it's you can't succeed on getting that right. So within that, we actually are just about to start a collaboration with the OECD to look at developing a way of measuring progression in the classroom in creativity, to provide teachers with tools which give them an idea about what's going on. There are various provisos that I'd say. I don't think creativity develops linearly. So an aspect of creativity, for instance, is risk-taking. Now, it doesn't mean that if you take big risks, you're more creative. You're just madder. And that's not what we're looking for. Therefore, in a lot of areas of creativity, it's the appropriate amount, if you see what I mean, which is what you're trying to look at, not if it's more or if it's less within that. So there are various provisos within that. We've actually talked to Education Scotland about whether they want to be part of an international pilot here. And they've said yes in principle, but they have one or two reservations, and the reservation is that the definition of creativity which we're going to build on, it's not the answer yet, that's the one that I showed you, has collaboration. And the work that Education Scotland did decided that collaboration, whilst very important, wasn't necessarily a creative skill. So there are some wording issues that we have to negotiate. But I hope in the next academic year there will be the opportunity to do some piloting in Scotland, as well as about another 6 or 7 countries around the world, in order to be able to measure it. One of the things that's really important is it's only going to be useful if people are doing something in schools which is making a difference in this area. Because otherwise what we can do is test them at the beginning of the year and test them at the end of the year. And although there'll be some control groups, what we want to know is what happens. So this is where, I mean, I think in the case of Edinburgh, for instance, there's the opportunity to look at some of the projects you might be doing next academic year to identify which schools this could take place in, which would be most interesting. But I get into lots of arguments with this, because lots of people go, no, we should never try to measure creativity, it's a disaster. But ultimately, I think it is possible, I think it will work, and most of all, it will persuade education directors that they need to do more of this. Won't it?
I love that, by the way.
He says yes.
Can we sign it? Yeah. Can we just note that we said to Education Scotland, how would you like to do some assessment around creativity involving risk-taking with our definition? And they said, oh, I'm not sure. Did I ever suggest to you that the exercise might be doomed? Yes, please.
Well, it's just a slightly different take on things and looking at it from a different perspective. We were all born creative. I think everyone was born to express themselves in a creative way, albeit different to each other. And I think in terms of when we educate people, it's also looking at how do we not suppress creativity. Not necessarily always how do we measure it and how do we bring it about, but how do we make it a natural process and something that we don't suppress. I think is really important, especially in the classroom.
I agree absolutely about that. There's another piece of work that we did which was looking at this. I was just going back to the definitions of creativity in order to explain this better. If you take the 5, I think young people arrive
into the education system on completely different places in this. So I've never found it necessary to encourage curiosity in a young child. They are bursting with curiosity on the whole. If you find one who isn't, there's usually another reason. On the other hand, I think they do have to learn to collaborate. It's one of the things that's going on in early years in particular, is being able to get those things. So I think there are ones you must make sure you're not suppressing, and there are ones which you are nurturing, and so forth. I think discipline is another one they're going to have to learn to do, if you see what I mean, and that kind of thing. So they are on different things, and you're right, is we must distinguish between those we mustn't suppress and those we must nurture. I agree.
Anyone else? Yep.
I was interested in what you were saying in PISA, and you were talking about educationalists think that they prepare young people for work, but employers don't so much think that, and young people don't think that so much. I suppose what I would be interested to hear from you about is what you think the purpose of school is. Are we there supplying young people for work?
That's a very good point. I certainly don't think that the point of education is to provide work for them, if you see it. The purpose of education for me is to allow that individual to realise their greatest potential, whatever that might be, you see it, in order to be able to do it. But the only point of that slide was to say, but educationists believe they are preparing people for work, and employers are saying no. So it's using their own definition about what they do.
I don't know if I'd entirely agree, because I think that if we asked educational, and we do ask educationalists that's one of their functions. You know, they might say, well, yes, we do,
yes, yeah.
but we are also doing this,
Yeah.
and curriculum for excellence and all its ways going forward are about so many things.
Yeah, no, I agree about that. I agree about that. And I do think that curriculum for excellence is an incredible platform to do everything that I'm talking about. There are other countries that we work in, you know, the curriculum is so inflexible and such a nightmare that actually just opening up these opportunities is very hard. There's no excuse for not doing this in Scotland.
Is there a bit of work to be done with parents around their perception of what would be being delivered as well?
Yes. I think there is a huge amount to be done with parents, and I think parents' views about the purpose of education are incredibly varied as well. You know, historically in England, schools we found it hardest to get any purchasing was the high-performing schools in middle-class areas where all the parents are doctors and lawyers, and they're just going, and that's time for this, why are you doing this, and so on and so forth. And there is that contingent, if you see what I mean. But then there's the contingent of parents who never turn up. And you never see and couldn't care less, and whose kids couldn't care less either because they know that their parents don't do it. So it is a very multifaceted thing. But there's a school in Darrin outside Oslo that we're working in at the moment, and we're working with the whole of Year 7, which is the last year of primary school in Norway, and they start a year later, so these are really 13, 14-year-olds and so forth. And in this particular school, about 95% of the children are of Pakistani or Turkish origin. And the project's going on over the whole year. But at the end of week 4, the kids did a presentation to their parents about what their learning was and what was going on. Because you have to engage them and you have to find a way to do it. And on the whole, my experience is if you can get the parents into the school, that's hard, and you can show them what they're really doing and why, the resistance melts, if you see what I mean. The problem is, at both ends, the ones who never come in, or the ones who don't listen to you, because they've made up their minds what education is, and they're going to shut up, just do this, and I want more of it, if you see what I mean. But that's where the children presenting their learning is much harder to refuse than the teacher explaining why it's happening. And we find that strategy works very well and should be a central part of what goes on with this.
Would you agree that would you agree that one way to engage parents more in creativity is to make people more aware of the value of play? I
absolutely think so.
and I think play is very, very central. But I'll give you another early years setting project that we did. The artist working in this 3 to 5 was a computer artist, a digital artist. And what he decided to do was to bring little cameras and get them to take photographs of the learning environment. And he had this comic software, and he'd get the photographs they took, and working with the child, would create a comic called My Day at Nursery. And then he'd print them out and laminate them, and he'd take it home. And the parents started coming in and reporting that these were a huge success, because you know kids at that age have their favourite books and they like to read them again and again. Well, My Day at Nursery, for most kids, became their favourite book, and they would read it again and again. And for the parents, they said it was fantastic because for the first time they found out what the kids were doing in nursery, because it had so much opportunity for conversation, let alone providing that focus for the parent and the child to be reading together in that very stage. Then the parents said, actually, could we borrow the cameras and bring them home? And we'll take photographs at home. And then we can do My Day at home. And so forth. And they did. And for the nursery teachers, this was absolutely fantastic because it gave them this incredible insight into where these kids were coming from, which allowed them to personalise their approaches. So they had those. And then people said, oh, but can I do a story? Creating stories. So a few of the kids started creating stories and working out how they would, how they would photograph that. And this grew and grew until the whole community was involved in this. And the nursery had to open on Saturday morning, where the dads could come in with costumes and sets and all this, and taking all these photographs and everybody in positions. And so this nursery had never seen any of these dads. It was absolutely not at all. So that way of creating a discussion between parents and children, and the arts that are insensitive to that, is really, really important.
And also what happens in the playground.
Yes,
As you were saying.
yes, absolutely, yes. Absolutely.
Okay, any final questions or points anyone wants to make? Yes.
The boycott woman.
That focus on the individual development, their self-led learning.
Absolutely. Hugely influenced. And I mean, I think that you can take most of what I talked about and just say, well, that really is. That really is. The thing about it, I think, that I would say is that they generally, I know that it's not really essential, everybody seems to think that's fine. And then you've got to do the education. And that's part of my argument. So why can't you just go on to do that? You want to do. So very, very little about that. And I certainly wouldn't try and argue for a minute that what I'm saying is new. Hasn't been known for a while. It's just going back and saying, how can we know this? And I think that part of the whole point of a presentation like this is to go, we know this, don't we? Why aren't we doing it? And the big question is not knowing it, it's why aren't we doing it? Yeah.
This isn't so much a question, but what I found interesting this morning in school, I think it was about the maths project. I think often they are seen as add-ons or a bit of fun to enliven the lesson. But what you said about them, they learn just as quickly as a traditional way of learning, that I thought was really interesting. That it wasn't an add-on, it wasn't an extra, it wasn't core learning.
And you're absolutely right about that. A very frequent response from teachers to me after they've done projects like this is that because people very often look at those videos and go, I don't really have the time, I've got a little amount of time. Go, actually, this took place inside the time. But I remember a biology teacher who had worked with 15-year-old boys on doing, there was another dance thing, but so she said, it would take me 4 weeks to teach that. It took me 1 day to teach it. And they got it and they never forgot it. And it's actually a more economical way. In the long run,
it does take a lot of teacher time to begin with to think it through, to do the planning, to get your head around. But as you go through that, it becomes second nature, and then you just find yourself doing it.
And I think that's a really interesting note to try and begin to pull some of the strands together from this, because genuinely we started off with the title, it's the Daft Punk song. If you're doing it right, everybody would be dancing. And what we've got in Scotland has been a fascinating week for me, this, because there have been so many things that have happened in the course of this week that have fed into what Paul's covered today. One of them was a session that I went to, it was a conference a couple of days back, and it was looking at employability and the Wood Commission, getting young people into work, all of that. And what it was a deification of the random local activity. So the entire event was people talking about something that was happening somewhere. And while that's excellent, well, it's wonderful that these things are happening, it doesn't add up to transformation and it doesn't equate to equity. And it's exactly the same, I think, with a number of the themes that we've touched on today. It's no comfort to know that these things are happening somewhere if that's not the place you are as a child. And what we're now talking about, and your question was brilliant for bringing it to the surface, what we're now talking about is a question of entitlement. That young people have an entitlement to an education which helps them to become equipped for learning life and work, regardless of what we think the core purpose of education is. And it's not up to us, wherever we sit within the profession, wherever we sit as agents, wherever we sit as contributors, it's not up to us to deny them that. And the whole idea, absolutely, one of the other things that fed into my thinking around this was I was working on a blog for a thing called Creative Bites that an organisation called Iris do. And the theme that I was developing through that is the extent to which a lot of the time in education we substitute activity for action. That we become engaged with things which are essentially, in Tim Brighouse's terms, high effort, low impact. And we engage in activities of that nature because we're bound to them by habit and we're bound to them by belief. And there's a really interesting phenomenon that when we come under pressure to raise attainment in schools, the tendency is that we almost go into a back brain activity where we trot out the tried and trusted. But if the tried and trusted was the secret of raising attainment, we wouldn't need to raise it in the first place. Because the one thing we're guaranteed that we will be doing is the tried and trusted. And what Paul did around this consistently through today, I mentioned it in the introduction of what he did consistently was talked about the double dividend. I'm doing a series of things just now, one of the other strands for this. I'm doing a series of things just now around leading in impossible times. It's a series of conversations that I'm working on, mainly with head teachers. And the issue about leading in impossible times, and we're doing them in England, is that it requires schools to work on both sides of the street. Because what you have in England is an ideology of education entirely thorough to the concept of competition and drive, where naming, blaming and shaming is a perfectly acceptable technique for generating improvement. Although anyone in the world would know that humiliation is not the first building block in reinventing yourself. And that whole concept that's around means that you have to create an ideology and a vision within your school, which you can then defend, build on, develop and deliver, despite the ideology that exists outside. And this year I think, there will be real tensions in the Scottish system in exactly the same way, because we're beginning already to talk about the drive to raise attainment. And we're beginning also to talk about those areas where we're falling behind in PISA, the league table of compliance, memorably described by Paul today. Right? And when we get into that, I think that what you'll see potentially is a stepping back from the creativity around curriculum for excellence and a reinforcement of curriculum for excellence, which of course, as we all know, is the remarkable tool that can perform any task in education. Or the Wood Commission, vocational education, that's what curriculum for excellence is designed for. Oh, creativity in the arts, curriculum for excellence is designed for that too. If you want to open a tin of beans, try curriculum for excellence. I don't know why the hell you call it a tin opener, because curriculum for excellence apparently can do everything else. No doubt it can do that too. I'm thinking of a wee refresher afterwards, a glass of wine, we mix up some curriculum for excellence, really spice it up. And it has become that, it ceased to be an entity, and it's become a convenience. And in this case, a public convenience. So everybody's allowed to make use of it, for whatever the end might be. And I think there's something fascinating around that, because it's not good enough to go on being self-congratulatory around what we're doing if it's not actually contributing to transformation. And that was the challenge from Paul, I think, and the challenge of the title, which is how do we get the activity which people are engaging with, often on a piecemeal basis, that add up to some form of transformation which actually has an impact on equity, improvement and opportunity. If it doesn't touch on these three elements, it's not what Curriculum for Excellence was designed for. What Curriculum for Excellence was designed for, I've probably said this to some people in this audience before, was to make systemic the kinds of improvement that we were seeing through schools of ambition. It wasn't designed to enable some things to happen in some places that would do well for some kids. It was designed to drive that level of improvement and that level of change through the system. It wasn't designed to be fragmentary, it was designed to be unitary. And that, in a sense, is what we need to make it. And the key thing coming back, I've used the key thing a number of times. The key thing coming back from what Paul was talking about today is that we already know so much of what the recipe is in order to make that change. But we are not collectively embracing it. And one of the other elements which has contributed to my thinking leading up to this was I was doing a session yesterday with young people, and it was based on My World of Work. They were My World of Work ambassadors from a number of schools. And my presentation to them was changing it to My World of Work. Because the reality, I think, around work is that regardless of how you think of it in vocational terms, it's one of the ways through which people define themselves. People define themselves on the basis of what they are part of. And my God, have we not seen that in a nationalist context in Scotland? How important it is for people to define themselves as what they are rather than who they are. But in the way that they find out who they are, the role of work, the role of what they do, all of that plays a massive part in that. And in order to achieve that, they need to develop a sense of work that allows them to make that kind of engagement. Work, I think, and you did this wonderfully, Paul, today, because at one point you were so close to just about saying this, but you said it more eloquently. And it was that idea that having that sense of work is what allows you to put the rest of the pieces of the jigsaw together. That without that core of self-respect, without that sense of yourself as a resilient entity capable of learning and meeting challenge and taking risks, without that sense of yourself, then you have no ability to pull the rest of the jigsaw together around you. Which is why we've got so many young people never more connected, yet never more alone. It's why we've got so many young people, and again, a theme that I've developed in these conversations before, so obsessed with the label, because their identity comes from the outside and not from the inside. And there's a really powerful set of issues around that. And what you talked about was creativity as a process, and also creativity as a range of activities which allow safe failure. The idea that through creativity, through that ability to make and shape, we can give ourselves some sense of that which we can control. And through that, give ourselves that sense of being able to control and shape our own lives, our own identity. And from that comes the springboard for further learning. But what you did beyond that, Paul, which I thought was marvellous, is you linked in to concepts like visible learning, which has been a huge issue for Lothian, that they're working on the whole idea that we learn best when we learn out loud. If we do not know what we've learned, we've got no platform for progression or continuity. But you went beyond learning out loud. You went into the idea of completely amplified learning. So that not only does the young person know that they have learned skills, ideas or concepts, but we make these visible and audible to parents and to that wider community. And that's how we change that sense of power and transformation. And a few things that it's worth saying. Balerno High School would be the classic school which should not be doing this kind of activity, a successful school in a prosperous area. And yet it is a school which is moving forward in terms of creativity and creative approaches. It's looking in all sorts of interesting ways at what they're doing. And I'm convinced that one of the reasons why they're able to do that is because of the work that they did with the Lyceum Theatre around, first of all, Project Dream and then Project Scrooge, where they made the incredible learning that was taking place through these projects absolutely visible and audible to parents. And what they did through that display was they built a confidence in this as a form of learning. And that's allowing a school, which has got no need, in some senses, to improve in the way that others have, to make these steps forward. I think some really, really valuable lessons built into that. And it's that whole idea, I think, of how we pull together these particular practical elements that Paul talked about around the maths projects, around the projects that they did on dance, all of that, how they make that learning into a way of thinking and being around education. Because the reality is it not, for secondary teachers in particular, that if you look at any syllabus for any examinable course, it's unteachable. There's always far more in any syllabus for any examinable course than you can ever teach. That's why, when we began Curriculum for Excellence, teachers simply said, we can't teach it until we see the exam. Because it's the exam that defines the curriculum, isn't it? That's how you make your way through the unteachable set of ideas, courses, knowledge, all of that that's been set out for you. And so we work back from the assessment rather than forward from the curriculum, because it is effectively, in most instances, unteachable. But what you did, again brilliantly, is you pointed out how often it is that we take the responsibility for the editing rather than empower the child to be able to do that editing for themselves. And that the investment in creating the child as a learner with the capacity for metacognition, as you described it in the maths example, is the most powerful way of enabling a child to be successful. What we're looking to do when we walk both sides of the street is to get higher attainment and greater capacity. And something else you did which really hit home with me, again because I was working week before last with a school, I spent the whole day with them. Their target was to improve their A-level performance. And the question that I was asking at one point in the day is, who are you improving this for? Is it for the school or for the young people? Because you can improve the A-level or indeed the higher results, or indeed any test results for the school, simply by being strong in exam technique, on revision, providing a lot of support, and in many instances turning a blind eye to the private tutoring that parents are engaging to support the children. And as you said, Paul, 13% of them fail in the first year of higher education. Keep making the same point, they've got the qualifications to get in, they don't have the education to survive. So we need to work out, when we talk about raising attainment, who we're raising attainment for, because we are not doing children any favours by giving them the key to a door which takes them into a room where they can't survive. What you set out for us today, Paul, I think, was very clearly an approach and an environment for learning within which children could not only learn to attain, but they could learn to survive and learn to thrive. So many messages in there that echoed with so many themes that we've had through these conversations, rarely more eruditely put together and summed up than they were today. Can you please thank Paul for his time?